Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Death tags and honorifics. For memory, for blessing, peace be upon him. Blessed is the true judge. In this joint episode of Unveiling Death and Weird Being Jewish, Rabbi Matt Reimer, Rabbi Josh Rose, and I explore what these phrases mean and whether we should use them at all. Hey, everybody.
Hey, Jeff.
Josh, Matt. Today we're talking about something interesting, honorifics, or perhaps appellations, not the mountain chain, but what one would say after to refer to someone who's died. And there are several ways of doing this in Hebrew, and they mean different things. So obviously the most prominent ones are like Zichronah Livracha, Zichrono Livracha, may her memory be for blessing, may his memory be for blessing, Zichronam Livracha, may their memories be for blessing. And also, Alav HaShalom and so forth, may that person rest in peace. Peace upon her or peace upon him. There's also one that's interesting, maybe for our times, Hashem Yikom Dama, may God avenge their blood, for martyrs, which is really an interesting one. So I'll start by asking you guys, when you refer to people who've died and you want to use one of the first two, most likely, what do you use and why?
I try to use in every situation, may God avenge their blood. I try to say that. I try to say that at every funeral, just because it's.
I do that when they're still alive.
Sorry, what was the question again?
What do you gravitate?
I want to zoom out a little bit, but I do think that it'll answer the question. I don't think I use anything. I find that what has happened speaks for itself. And anything that I or our tradition adds, in a way, minimizes it. I'd love to talk a little bit about that. I find that the process our tradition allows for, specifically regarding death, is so incredibly beautiful, meaningful, powerful, personal. And then there are also these other parts that I genuinely struggle with as a rabbi, as someone who has experienced loss, all of those parts. And that's really the space that I wanted to enter into today.
You're saying you try to avoid using those phrases in general? And then I'm also curious, when you say as someone who has experienced loss, like how is that affecting your take on it?
Yeah, I certainly avoid them in general. In other words, I generally don't say, if I'm giving a sermon and I'm quoting a teacher or somebody, or my mom or somebody, I don't generally say, may her memory be for a blessing in the course of me talking. I also tend to not necessarily say a particular phrase if I'm officiating at a funeral, unless it feels prescribed in that moment, which I'm also quite comfortable with. Right? Zichronam Livracha is a comfortable phrase within the context of either pre or post mourner's Kaddish.
So you actually you consciously avoid the phrase.
Like I said, I don't know if you weren't listening, so that's fine. I don't know if I consciously avoid the phrase or I somehow subconsciously choose, I'm just not into saying that.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
All right.
Josh?
Yeah, actually, I think the reason this popped into Matt's head as a topic is Matt called to tell me about the untimely passing of somebody, and I reflexively said, Baruch Dayana Emet. Blessed is the judge of truth, and that is something that the tradition that we're required to say when we hear bad news. And Matt reacted and was pressing me like why I say that. And I think Matt may have had two reasons. One was just in general, I think Matt was like, what's that about? And also specifically, given that I'm no longer religious, Matt was interested that I saw fit at that moment to use that blessing.
So why was that, Josh? Because as being quote unquote no longer religious, what was the impulse?
Honestly, I don't know, but it was something more than just reflexive.
Hmm.
It definitely was. It was really terrible news. It was somebody our age who had died, and I don't know. It just felt like I wanted to honor that person in some little way. I did think this feels like it needs to be said. But let me just go back one step. I do say Zichronam Livracha, or Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be a blessing, may their memory be a blessing. And in the context of a funeral, I would often belabor it and explain, and I would invite people typically at a funeral or at the Shiva to really work at making the person's memory a blessing, to take some lesson from their life or remember them in some beautiful way. So anyway, I do use it.
So Josh, for you, you're saying that in the context of who you are as a religious person or not, to whatever the limitation is, it's also the gravity of the moment. Matt was sharing with you news that was just heavy, grave news, and besides wanting to honor that person, maybe it was just like a way to match the moment with appropriate words.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, there's something about matching the moment.
What's so complex about that is my instinct, and jokingly, and Josh actually called me out, jokingly, I pretended like I freaked out and got actually angry at him using that phrase. But
it was weird because I actually thought Matt was mad. I thought he had triggered something for a second. It was really odd.
That is weird being Jewish.
It is really weird being Jewish.
But I actually this is now like Inception a little bit, but I was purposely pretending to be mad because of the construct of two things. One is, as Josh pointed out, this being specifically a really interesting thing that he would say, knowing where Josh is on his own personal journey, but also the phrase that you just said, meeting the moment, the intensity, the power of the moment. My instinct is that Baruch Dayan HaEmet, it offensively takes away from that moment. That is my visceral triggering reaction to that phrase. And I acted on that triggering on purpose just because it's fun to rib him. But all of that was tied into that moment.
That's interesting. That's like a very, to say that Baruch Dayan HaEmet, blessed is the judge of truth, to say that takes away from the moment, makes the moment not a moment in which the judge of truth or even God is involved at all. In other words, it makes it more of a, I don't know, like a this worldly, like a humanist reaction as opposed to a religious reaction.
I think it's worth actually just stopping here and exploring the phrase itself. The phrase itself, it feels minimizing and allowing room for saying, we don't understand why God chooses to act out God's truth.
Right. That's exactly what it means. That's precisely what it's about. I for sure.
Which is fine. And I think the words that I'm about to use don't speak to the moment, but for lack of a better phrase, I find that thinking, and I want to hear more, Jeff. I want to hear what your take is on that. My take on that reading of the phrase is offensive.
Oh, really? I think so. I hear you. I think the context, though, like you were mentioning, I think that is the context. In other words, we don't exactly like when you hear the news and when you do Kriya, when you do the tearing, it happens at a couple of different possible times. Very often right before a funeral begins, but it can happen also at hearing the news. But anyway, it's a tearing like our biblical forebears did when they heard calamitous news. They would tear their garment, and when a parent dies, the child would do the tearing over the heart, Kriya, and for the other direct relatives, it would be on the other side, on the right side. But in any event, it's a tearing, and the idea is we mortals don't get why this happened. Now, sometimes we do get, the person was like 102 years old and whatever, but very often, like the situation you guys were talking about before, we don't get why this happened. And so we're saying about this moment that is like inexplicable. Somebody understands this, and that's God, because God is the Dayan HaEmet, the judge of truth. And we are just down here trying to figure out the inexplicable.
Matt, I have a question for you. Is it offensive to you because you hear blessed is the true judge, as like an implicit judgment of the individual who died. Like God decided this person shouldn't live because of their lack of meritoriousness or something. Is that what bothers you about it?
What's coming up for me right now is imagining myself saying that to a family that just suffered a horrific loss. Our tradition gives us the opportunity to say that phrase anytime there's a death, right? That is very customary upon hearing of a death, no matter who, no matter how, no matter why, to say that phrase. Putting that in context, I'm imagining that what's coming up for me in how I would go out of my way to avoid that as the hearer of that phrase, what the F does God's truth have to do with what happened and how I'm feeling about it right now? That is not a rhetorical question that I'm supposing.
Right.
I am imagining the parent, the partner, the child looking at me in the face and saying, really?
Why'd you just say that?
Why did you just say that?
Yeah.
That's true. You got to know your audience.
That's where I am. But actually, this is why it's such an interesting phrase. Our tradition is telling us the audience doesn't matter. Right. You just said you got to know your audience. Our tradition is saying no, the audience does not matter. This is what we say upon hearing of a death.
I think it's interesting because I think that there's two different ways of looking at this thing. And one is the philosophical theological. The other is the pastoral, meaning in the first one, there's a conversation about anything that happens in the universe is in some sense decreed by God, and that gives life meaning, whether we like it or not. And then what Matt is bringing up is the pastoral dimension. Sometimes we're working with families who are in grief, and the theology is of no use to somebody who's at least in the immediate aftermath of a loss. And so anyway, I'm just thinking of those two dimensions, and one has to separate them.
I'm just going to say that, I that's why you say, Matt, that's what the tradition demands. But we're liberal Jews in the classical sense of that. In other words, we take the tradition as a guide, but not as a command. So I understand that the tradition demands that at that point, or commands that at that point. But we, as hopefully sensitive people, will use it when it's appropriate, or find something else when it's not appropriate. And that requires a sensitivity.
We are deciding now. The fact that you're saying you got to know your audience, or in the right moment is when you would say that, suggests that emotionally and perhaps even intellectually, we know that the right moment is actually not upon hearing of a death. Nonetheless, that's what our tradition tells us.
I'll just say this, though. In terms of the emotional depth or connection that you might need, even if I were to say to someone who is not wanting to hear "Blessed is the true judge," if your Gestalt approach to them at that very sensitive, vulnerable moment is a sensitive one, I think typically they're not going to be put off by those three words.
I'm not even necessarily talking about the audience. To be honest, even though in my example, I'm talking about the family that just suffered a horrific loss. My reaction is about the requirement to say it, not hear it.
Okay.
And the saying part is the struggle.
Do you object to any other blessing that's required?
I am so glad you said that, because what I was thinking, if you don't mind me, Jeff, before you move on and hijack this really meaningful conversation, I have used this term when I'm leading Shabbat services, that we do not as a people get to pick and choose the prayers that are included in Mincha, Mariv, Shabbat, whatever it is. And so every single time we formally gather for prayer, we say Modim Anachnu Lach. We say the Modim prayer of thanks, no matter how we're feeling, whether we're feeling grateful or not. And I even know intellectually that in our tradition, we say prayers that we don't necessarily want to say, feel the need to say, or are even offended that we have to say.
All the time, by the way.
All the time. And so there's a tension that I'm willing to accept intellectually. For our purposes, I was just honing in on that. But I think it's such a good question, Josh.
I think that's the nature of prayer. I'm going to get to actually a variation on the Zichronam Livracha, may their memory be for blessing, or Zichrono, Zichrona. It's Zecher Tzadik Livracha. May the righteous person's memory be for blessing. And that's for the holy people. And I've heard rabbis do that for just at the end of a eulogy for any person. And Zecher Tzadik Livracha is not supposed to be like for just the regular Jew.
It's not supposed to be for the Matt Reimers of the world.
I was going to say for the Jeffrey Wiles. That's
the riffraff.
But they're definitely for the Joshua Roses of the world. But I don't like that. I really hate the Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Because who decides who's the tzaddik? Who's deciding that? I think that's just so callow and foolish. Like,
really?
Yes, really. I think that's pomposity. I hate the whole sage thing. If we're talking about the sages, I do. Maybe because I'm just a pale imitation. But if we're talking about the sages of yore. Then
by the way, I love that Jeff will sometimes throw in some really sages of yore. I genuinely love that.
That's one thing.
Okay, sorry, finish your thought, because I want to explore that.
Sages of yesteryear. That's one thing, because they're the real sages. But if it's just people that we're talking about, honestly, viscerally, like Matt's reaction, viscerally, I hate that we're saying that certain people are tzaddiks, and so they deserve Zecher Tzadik Livracha, and then the rest, and the other people are not. What do they know?
I see.
I hate that. That is a kind of like hero worship, which is basically, that could veer into idolatry.
To get too dark, but just to irritate you, if I outlive you, I'm going to say that at the proper moment. But listen, so do you reject the idea that there are tzaddikim? Just set aside whether somebody ought to say it at any random funeral, because we know or don't know. But are there certain people who are at a higher level?
Probably not.
Really?
Yeah.
It's so interesting now, the direction, because, and I don't want to speak for Josh, but having known him for a long time, one of the reasons why Josh left the rabbinate and left that world is because he actually did see that very much. Josh, do you want to speak to that? That you actually do see that there are tzaddikim in the world. I
do. I think so. I concluded, listen, I'm too good for these people. I can't. No, I do. I think that there are people who have brought great people who've changed history and who brought great goodness into the world and who moved through the world as incredible teachers. It doesn't mean they're perfect, and then there are people who are just live their lives and don't have an impact on the world. It's not pretty to say that because we don't like to think in that way.
I don't feel that way.
It's interesting because there's two things coming up for me. One is the story of Zusia. When Zusia dies, God is not going to ask, why were you not more like Moses? But God's going to ask, why are you not more like Zusia? And so I do think that what's inherent in the phrase is that everybody is a righteous person. It's just a question of whether or not you live out that righteousness.
Nice.
Right? That's, I think, what, in my mind, what the phrase is suggesting. What I'm thinking about, though, is how little I care about that phrase being used or not versus what we were just Bruch Dayan Ha'emet.
Right.
That one is visceral and one is not. And at the end of the day, okay, yeah, they both are, or neither of them are. Like you're just having a problem with semantics.
Or maybe there's that teaching that like everybody has their mitzvah, that like they're really gifted. Everybody has their phrase that they hate.
Or no, just to bring this back, and then I'm going to go to a different phrase. Like maybe I don't like the Yeah, I just don't like calling people this or that, genius or anything, because then if some people are geniuses, some people are not, and then it makes it like, what do you know about that? What do you know about
Well,
geniuses? How do you define that?
listen, wait, hold on. Let me just hold your horses, Rabbi. How do you? First of all, I think I agree with you that it's not a term that should be randomly thrown around for this congregant or that congregant, but there are geniuses. Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein.
Never heard of them. Never heard of them.
These are people who they've offered a lot more intellectually, and I'm not saying that's a tzaddik, that's a different thing, but than I have or will. Doesn't mean they have. I think one of the to draw a distinction, the Jewish tradition says there's an irreducible value and dignity to every human being, no matter what. But in my mind, that doesn't mean we're all righteous people or we're all. Give me an example of a moral hero in the modern era. Who's a moral hero? I was going to use the example of Martin Luther King. It's not a great example because, on the other hand, we know all kinds of things about his personal
life. That's why I don't like this. Take him, and I listen to his I Have a Dream speech, and I get teary every single time. That is a moment of like divine genius. But I just feel like a lot of it is circumstantial. A lot of it is ambition. The people who lead really quiet lives that are not noteworthy beyond the walls of their homes. I'm not, just because they don't have the circumstance, the ambition, the background, the encouragement to do something grander, in other words, bigger. I'm not going to take.
But listen, there too. But there, sorry, and this could be its own. This should be its own conversation, whether there are tzaddikim. But
yeah.
And to your point, Jeffrey, there's the tradition of the Lamed Vavniks, the 36 individuals who sustain the world because of their righteousness, and we don't even know who they are. So it's a good point, an interesting one. But on the other side of it, to me, there's an element that connects us to the Baruch Dayan Emet. There's stuff that happens that none of us is in charge of, right? Rabbi Akiva, yes, it was maybe ambition and circumstance and accident of history. Like, it's not saying that somebody is a tzaddik. Maybe it's not entirely that person's doing. Maybe it's all God's doing, but that person stands out for some reason.
I'm just going to go to another one, and then we're conclude. Aleha hashalom, alehem l'shalom, alav hashalom. May she, may they, may he have peace. Peace upon them, basically. It's like rest in peace. And that's obviously a really common one. So we should talk about that a little bit, at least.
Give me your take on that?
My take on that is that's like the simplest one and almost the sweetest one. Like, it's not really saying anything other than may peace be upon them in the afterlife and forever, regardless of anything, moral, immoral, whatever their memory is, whatever memory they leave behind, memory for blessing, whatever. It's just she lived her life. He lived his life. It was flawed and it was great. And it might have been more of one than the other. They got through it. They're done with it. It took a long time or a short time. And may they just have peace now. I like that because it has a certain amount of pity on all of us down here.
Not that such a blessing or whatever phrase has to give itself up to this kind of scrutiny, but what does it mean? Like, literally, what are we actually saying in your mind? What are we saying?
I think it really means rest in peace, because a peace.
And what does that mean? What does that mean?
That means may their repose be when they're dead, while they are dead. It really assumes, by the way, an after existence, an existence after life. Yeah. Whereas Zichrono Livracha does not. That just means may the memory be for blessing.
But keep going, yeah.
Okay. So peace upon her means that she will be able to experience something after she is dead. There's an afterlife, some kind of existence, and that she herself, like her own nefesh, her own like existence, essence, should be able to enjoy, at the very least, shalom, which is a sense of wholeness and peacefulness for that next step in existence.
See, I think that, this is one that I don't like. So this is one that when I say at a funeral, I make it a point to roll my eyes as I say it. But no.
Good, yes.
Yeah, or I'll do this sometimes. I'll just do the circle next to...
It's hard to believe why you're no longer a congregational rabbi.
But I will just say that when I say may their memory be a blessing, I can make that real. I can make that real without resort to theology or fantasy. But may peace be upon them. I don't believe I'm saying anything because I don't believe that they exist in any sense when their body
And that
is
would definitely be
dead.
empty words. I
Yeah.
get that. Yeah. Matt, how do you feel about that?
It's very interesting because just the conversation and our relationship with these phrases. One of the things that I love about Hebrew is that every word can be distilled down to its root. And so I don't see it about peace. I see it about shalem, about fullness,
Shlemut, wholeness,
and wholeness. And I've used this as a rabbi, and I've used it as a son, and I've used it for families that are truly struggling, and I've used it in my own approach to death. I think for me, there is something very powerful and beautiful to imagine that the person who has died is now whole.
Yeah, I think that.
And the idea that sort of comes out of that allows any of us to make room for, and in a weird sort of way, it circles back to the Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, that, because this person is full and whole, the issues of pain and suffering are no longer applicable.
Yeah, I like that.
And it gives so much comfort to try and position our grief, in addition to the grief, in a place of, wow, may that be how everybody's days end.
Yeah.
In being whole.
And continue. In other words, how one's existence continues.
I don't even necessarily know about the continue part, but I'm down. I'm down to think about that.
Right.
Jeffrey, is that how?
I could even argue that in the moment, because there is wholeness and fullness, I don't even know what continuing looks like, because what is there to continue if you're full? And
Jeffrey, is that how you think about it? Is that what resonates for you?
I definitely think about it as an afterlife. In other words, at a point when one's days are no longer at all, because days is a way to mark time, when in a timeless way, in a way that we really cannot understand, that the Dayan Ha'emet, the judge of truth, will be just like, enjoy this. You won't miss Netflix. You won't miss anything. You just enjoy this. It's going to feel just so good forever, and you'll never be bored by it. It'll just be like really beautiful. That's what I like to think about.
There are people who have made a mess of their life. People who are just not nice people, or people who throw their weight around, or God forbid have done terrible things.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a reading at their funeral. Maybe there's a reading of peace be upon them, meaning, listen, they're gone now. Those stories that we all know about them that are terrible stories, those are gone now. Let this person be at rest.
The person no longer has to be like that. The resentments, the indictments, the judgment, the jealousy, the hostility, the anger, the cynicism, the narcissism. Honestly, all of that is no longer a part of this person because they're full.
Yeah.
Or they're just done with all that terrible stuff that brought them a lack of shlemut too.
Yes.
By the way, Matt, we want names. Give us names, because as Matt was saying that stuff, he really came alive. I think you had individuals in mind.
I think you're looking at me.
I might have been talking about people that I know. I'm sure we're all talking about people that we know.
Yep.
Yeah.
But when I do think about framing it within the context of the pain that this person might have been feeling, whether it was because of cancer or whether it was because their inability to see the beauty in the world and the beauty of the world around them and the people in their lives, imagine what it would look like for them to not have the physical pain, the mental pain, the emotional pain, because they're shalem, because they're full.
Right.
Killing me softly with your song, telling my mind.
Killing me softly.
What a talent. Matt, that was beautifully stated, the last part, and we should definitely, I wish we had recorded that. Oh, we did record it. Rabbi Rose, Rabbi Reimer, Rabbi Josh, Rabbi Matt, thank you so much. Wonderful to talk to you today.
Thanks, fellas. That was great as usual.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Rabbis Josh Rose and Matt Reimer. Thank you, creative director, editor, son, Sammy Weil. Share this episode with friends and enemies alike, and follow Unveiling Death and Weird Being Jewish. Check out the Unveiling Death podcast playlist on Spotify. Lots and lots of songs. Thank you, dear friends, for listening to Unveiling Death. Eternity in about 24 minutes, every other Monday.